Hi everyone, my name's Chris and a friend of mine recently asked me whether it's possible to build a decent gaming PC in the UK for around £160. And by decent I mean it's got to be able to play esports games like Fortnite and Apex Legends at high frame rates and also run AAA titles like Doom Eternal and Shadow of the Tomb Raider at playable frame rates. And what you're looking at right now is the PC I built for just over £160. In this video I'll run through all of the components I've used to build this budget gaming PC. I'll also run through a bunch of benchmarks later in this video, but as a teaser, this cheap gaming PC can run Fortnite at 100 plus frames per second and also run more demanding games like Doom Eternal at surprisingly good frame rates, all for less than the cost of a used PS4. Okay, with that said, let's take a look at the PC I used as the basis of this project. Now, people building cheap gaming PCs on YouTube tend to say the same thing. Buy a cheap Dell Optiplex and throw a low wattage GPU in it, something like an Nvidia GTX 750 Ti. And sure, that's one option. There's no shortage of cheap Optiplexes available, but this approach isn't always as simple as it sounds. You could find yourself dealing with non-standard motherboard connections, plus you're stuck dealing with a lockdown BIOS. I've personally had issues with Optiplex machines refusing to recognise certain sticks of RAM. It's also a bit of a lottery whether they'll recognise the CPU or GPU you'd like to use. So for this reason, I decided to try and avoid an Optiplex and instead opt for something else. This is when I stumbled across Novatech. They're a UK-based PC manufacturer, but rather than make their own motherboards, they use third-party motherboards from well-known brands. And this is the PC I went for, a Novatech system based on a 4th generation Intel CPU. I paid £59.99 delivered for this on eBay. Now sure, it was cheap, but when it arrived I was greeted by this. It was absolutely filthy. So I spent the first few hours of owning this machine using a Hoover and other cleaning products to give it a good clean. Fortunately, the various components came up great and more importantly they worked perfectly. So let's take a look at what's inside the Novatech PC that's going to be used for a budget gaming PC. So first things first, I was pleased to see that this machine is packing a Gigabyte H81 motherboard. We've got USB 3 and SATA 3.0 on board. And as mentioned earlier, instead of dealing with a lockdown OEM BIOS, we've got a good quality Gigabyte UEFI BIOS to work with. And because this is a Gigabyte motherboard, we're also working with completely standard power and fan connectors. So there's no need to mess with any adapters when upgrading components. Plus, let's be honest, this Gigabyte motherboard with its black PCB and white writing just looks so much better than the motherboards you get in typical OEM systems from Dell, Lenovo and Acer. Next up, let's take a look at the CPU. The listing stated that this machine was running an i3-4170, but when pulling the system apart I found an i3-4130. I was a bit disappointed by this, but it's a cheap PC so I can't complain too much. Plus we're going to be upgrading the CPU anyway. We'll also be using the stock Intel cooler. It's not pretty, but it's relatively quiet and we won't be overclocking our CPU, so this should cope just fine. Next up, this machine came fitted with a single 4GB stick of 1600MHz DDR3, and because we're using a Gigabyte motherboard we can make sure this is running at the right speed. This is an area that's given me trouble on OEM motherboards. I had an Optiplex that supported 1600MHz RAM according to the Dell documentation, but instead defaulted to 1333MHz. And lastly, this machine came fitted with a 500GB Western digital hard drive. Nothing particularly special, but it's a 7200 RPM drive and is big enough to store a few games. And all of this came wrapped in a fairly generic Novatech case. It's not going to win any awards for style, but it's not ugly and there's plenty of room for long graphics cards. And this brings us to the fun bit, upgrades. Now when picking out upgrades I had a choice, prioritise CPU power or GPU power. For this reason I've opted to upgrade to a relatively inexpensive i5-4590 CPU. This cost £26.95 delivered. I was also able to sell the i3 back to CEX for a £5, which subsidises the cost of our i5. I'm also of the opinion that a quad-core CPU is a minimum for gaming nowadays, and these 4th gen quad-cores still do a decent job in 2020. Plus, opting for a relatively inexpensive CPU leaves us with more budget for a graphics card, but before we can do that we're going to need to upgrade the stock PSU. The 300W item it came with is fine for an office PC, but we'll need something more powerful to run a decent graphics card. So after watching many auctions I went for this Corsair VS550 PSU. It was on auction with the option to make an offer. I offered £28.50 which the seller accepted, so with postage this came to £32.20. And importantly, this PSU has two 8-pin PCI Express connectors. This really opens up our options when it comes to choosing a graphics card. Next I picked up a second 4GB stick of DDR3 1600MHz RAM from my local CEX store. This cost me £8. It's a Mushkin stick, so should be of decent quality. This gives us a total of 8GB of RAM, which is just about enough for modern games. And now for the most important bit of this build, the graphics card. After looking around, I opted for a Radeon 7970, which I picked up from CEX for £41.95 delivered. Now when ordering from CEX, there's no way of knowing exactly which card you'll get. If you're lucky, you might get a card with an aftermarket cooler, but the card CEX sent me is a reference design, and initially I was having some issues with it running a bit hot, but stripping it down, giving it a good clean and replacing the thermal paste sorted this out. It's also worth noting that there's two versions of the 7970. Earlier cards that run with a 925MHz core clock, and the later GHz edition cards that tend to run a bit faster, at something like 1030MHz as standard. The card I received is the earlier 925MHz model, but I was able to overclock it to match the core speeds of the later GHz edition and didn't have any issues running on these settings. The 7970 is still a decent card. When it launched, it was often compared to the GTX 770, but more recently, and thanks to having better support for low-level APIs like Vulkan, it often outperforms the GTX 780 in new titles. So at £40ish, these are an absolute bargain. At this stage, I just want to mention a couple of optional extras. You don't need these to get the system up and running, but they're nice to have if you've got a bit of extra cash. The first of these options is to add an SSD. You can get by with just the mechanical hard drive, but I really struggle using PCs without an SSD nowadays. Everything just feels so much slower without an SSD. You can pick up a decent 240GB SSD for £25 nowadays, and they're worth every penny. Even if you don't have the cash to add an SSD straight away, I'd make it the first upgrade you make when you do have some more cash. And finally, I picked up a 120mm red LED fan to blow some cool air towards our graphics card. Again, this is optional. The graphics card wasn't overheating without this, but for the extra £6.50, this is well worth adding. Plus, I wanted to add a bit of colour to our case. I'll add links to the bits I'm using in the description section below. Okay, so without the SSD and additional fan, this machine comes to just over £160. Even with the SSD and fan, it still comes in at under £200. So with that said, let's take a look at some benchmarks and see what this budget gamer can do. Okay, so there you have it. At times the performance I was getting from this budget gaming PC genuinely surprised me. We've built an entire PC for less than the cost of a GTX 660. And what I think is great about this approach is that when you are ready to upgrade to a more powerful graphics card, you've already got a good enough power supply to run most modern graphics cards. Sure, it may have worked out a bit more expensive than going down the low wattage graphics card route, but I think spending a little bit more now will be worth it in the long run. On that note, I'm going to end this video here. I hope it's helped some of you. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments below and consider subscribing to the channel. I'll be back soon with another PC build. Thanks for watching, bye for now.